The weapon wasn't what stopped her. It was the smell. Fleet Arbiter Tessavain Oru had reviewed 10,000 battlefield reports across her 40-year career with the Galactic Council's Enforcement Division. She had processed accounts of plasma burns, antimatter detonations, the particular devastation wrought by Vethkai sonic arrays. She had read clinical descriptions of things that no longer existed because weapons had made them not exist. None of those reports had ever mentioned smell. But the human vessel's log, recovered from the wreckage of the Kestrel Point engagement, had a notation in the margin, handwritten, in ink, on actual paper, which the humans apparently still used despite possessing perfectly functional digital systems, a fact that had always unsettled her in ways she couldn't quantify. The notation read, "They'll smell it before they see it. Make sure they do. That's the point." Tessavain set the paper down very carefully. She looked at the casualty figures again. Then she looked at the notation again. Then she closed the file and sat in silence for a long moment before calling her adjutant. "Get me everything we have on what humans were doing in the 6 months before Kestrel Point," she said. "Not the weapons programs, the other programs. The ones we decided weren't worth monitoring." Her adjutant hesitated. "Arbiter, those files are." "I know what they are," Tessavain said. "Get them anyway." Because she had just realized something that the Council's weapons assessors had missed entirely. Something so obvious it was almost insulting that it had taken this long to surface. The railgun ban hadn't slowed the humans down. It had aimed them. The ban itself had seemed reasonable at the time. That was the cruelest part of the whole affair, as Tessavain would later note in her formal report. Not that the Council had acted in bad faith, but that they had acted in perfect good faith, with complete logical consistency, and had still managed to construct the single most catastrophically mistaken policy decision in 400 years of interstellar governance. The Meridian Accords of 2271. Humans were still using their own calendar. Another thing the Council had unanimously decided not to fight about, had established clear parameters for kinetic weapons in contested space. The railgun prohibition wasn't specifically anti-human. 14 other species had their kinetic programs regulated under the same framework. The Council's logic was sound. A kinetic projectile traveling at a significant fraction of light speed carried enough energy to crack a moon given sufficient mass, and the proliferation of such weapons among younger spacefaring civilizations posed a genuine existential risk to inhabited systems. The Voth Compact agreed. The Ceralian hegemony agreed. The Muranth Collective abstained but didn't object. Even the Dakhine, famously territorial and suspicious of any council authority, had signed without major protest. The humans had agreed too, signed the accords, decommissioned their railgun systems on schedule, submitted to 3 separate verification inspections. The inspectors had found nothing. The Council had issued a brief commendation for human compliance and moved on to other concerns. That was the first misinterpretation, and it would not be the last. What no one had thought to ask, what it had genuinely not occurred to any of the 14 species sitting on the Council to wonder, was what humans did when they were told they couldn't do something they'd been doing. Because the real answer was not, they stop. The answer was something considerably more disturbing. They think about why they were doing it in the first place. Commander Ilara Vasquez had not slept in 31 hours when the Council's verification team arrived at Meridian Station. This was not unusual. She had gone longer. She would go longer again. Sleep deprivation was something she had long since stopped thinking of as suffering and started thinking of as a condition. The way a swimmer thinks of water being wet, simply the medium in which certain kinds of work get done. She met the Voth lead inspector, a tall and faintly luminescent being named Surveyor Third Commies, with the specific kind of smile she'd learned to produce on demand. Professional, warm, completely opaque. Commander Vasquez. Kami's translation collar rendered the words in smooth, gender-neutral standard. We appreciate your cooperation with the verification process. Of course, Alara said. We've prepared full access to all relevant facilities. The relevant facilities. Kami seemed to test the phrase. You are aware our mandate includes any kinetic acceleration system with a barrel length exceeding 40 meters, muzzle velocity threshold of 0.03 c. Yes, she held his gaze steadily. You'll find nothing above threshold. You're welcome to measure. They measured, they found nothing above threshold. They left satisfied. What Kami's had not thought to ask, because it was not a question that would have occurred to Avath, who were methodical and precise and thought in clear taxonomic categories. What he had not asked was, what are the humans doing with a research division that has 47 material scientists, 12 electromagnetic engineers, and a specialist in non-Newtonian fluid dynamics, none of whom appear to be building railguns? The answer was that they weren't building railguns. They had genuinely, completely, with full legal compliance, stopped building railguns. They were building something else. The first hint the Council received that something had changed came not from their intelligence apparatus, but from a shipping manifest. Tessavain only found it because she was specifically looking for things the Council had decided weren't worth monitoring, and a shipping manifest for industrial quantities of a carbonarogel composite to a human research station in the outer meridian belt seemed, on its surface, exactly like the kind of thing that wasn't worth monitoring. Except that the carbonarogel composite in question had a specific thermal resistance profile that made it ideal for lining the interior of something experiencing extremely rapid, extremely high-energy physical events. Not explosions. The profile was wrong for explosions. Tessavain had cross-referenced. The profile was right for something moving very fast through a very contained space, without the system itself flying apart. She pulled up a second manifest. A third. Specialty lubricants. Electromagnetic coil windings with a particular inductance rating. Superconducting arrays. Each item individually innocuous. Each item with a benign civilian application that explained its presence on a customs form. Each item, taken together, describing something she didn't have a name for because it wasn't in any weapons taxonomy she had access to. Her communication system chimed. The Kestrel Point fleet engagement had begun 40 minutes ago. She was receiving the first fragmentary reports. Arbiter. Her adjutant's voice was unusual in a way she couldn't immediately classify. The human vessel, the Riven Shore, is reporting contact with the Dakin Intercept Squadron. Status. The Dakin Squadron is, a pause, they're retreating, Arbiter. Tessavain stood up slowly. Dakin did not retreat. It wasn't psychology or stubbornness. Their tactical doctrine literally had no formal framework for withdrawal from an engagement they had initiated. It was considered a category error, like a calculator refusing to display a negative number. What's driving the retreat? Another pause, longer this time. We don't know. The Dakin Squadron's communications are. The word the translator is using is disrupted, but I think the more accurate translation is the crew is not responding to commands in an organized way. Casualties. None confirmed. The Dakin vessels appear structurally intact. They're just leaving, Tessavain said. Yes, very fast. She looked at the shipping manifest still open on her screen. She thought about carbonarogel composites and non-Newtonian fluid dynamics. She thought about a handwritten note on a piece of actual paper that talked about smell. Connect me to whatever human vessel is in communication range, she said, and get me a xenobiologist. A xenobiologist? Why? Because I want to know what the Dakin can smell, Tessavain said, that we can't. The Riven Shore was not a warship. This was another thing the Council's assessors had gotten wrong, cataloged her as a medium-range patrol vessel, which was technically accurate in the same way that describing a human being as a collection of organic compounds was technically accurate and completely useless. The riven shore was what happened when Alara Vasquez had been given a budget, a mandate to operate in contested space, and the specific instruction that she could not use railguns. She had taken 11 months to figure out what she was going to do instead. The ship's chief engineer, a heavy-set Londoner named Priya Mach, who had the particular quality of seeming always to be doing 3 things at once and paying full attention to all of them, had been the one to identify the core problem. "We're not trying to destroy things," Priya had said during the 3rd week of design sessions. She'd been eating something at the time she was always eating during design sessions, a habit that had initially baffled and eventually charmed the rest of the team. "We're trying to make things stop being a problem. Those are different requirements." "They seem similar," Alara had replied. "They're not. Destroying something is permanent and expensive and creates a lot of paperwork about war crimes. Stopping something from being a problem is temporary and cheap and creates paperwork about de-escalation, which everyone prefers." Priya had taken another bite of whatever she was eating. "Also, destroying things is what the Council expects us to try to do, so they'll be looking for that. And if they're not looking for the other thing?" Priya had smiled. It was not a particularly comfortable smile. "Then we have 11 months to get very creative." The weapon, if weapon was even the right word, and Alara increasingly suspected it wasn't, operated on a principle that had no exact name in standard translation. The humans called it a LRAD derivative, which meant low-range acoustic delivery, which was technically what it was, except that nothing about it was quite low-range anymore. And acoustic delivery implied a certain gentleness that the reality of it did not support. The core insight, the one Priya had arrived at during a particularly sleepless week that she later referred to only as the Dark Tuesday, was that kinetic weapons were prohibited because of what they did to matter, to hulls, to structures, to physical things. But there was a category of harm that was not kinetic in any sense the Accords addressed. Harm to perception, to equilibrium, to the fundamental neurological capacity to continue functioning. Sound at sufficient intensity and at precisely tuned frequencies did not damage ships. It damaged the beings inside them. Every spacefaring species in the known galaxy had auditory processing systems. They had too. Sound carried information in atmospheres, which every species had evolved within. The specific frequencies that caused confusion, panic, vertigo, and the particular deep neurological terror that had no good name in most languages, but that humans had long called infrasound dread. Those frequencies were different for every species. They required careful calibration. Priya had calibrated. The Council's Accord said nothing about sound. Why would they? Sound was not a weapon, it was physics. It was a property of atmosphere, you couldn't ban physics. "The first time we use it," Alara had said, reviewing the final design, "they'll update the Accords." Yes, Priya had agreed. "How long do we have before that happens?" "1 engagement, maybe 2. Then we need to make it count." That conversation was 6 months before Kestrel Point. It sat in the *Riven Shores log, time-stamped and preserved, though neither of them had expected anyone outside their crew to ever read it. It was not a conversation about victory or defeat. It was a conversation about time management, about how to spend a resource you know you won't have again. Tessa Vane, reading the transcript 3 days after the engagement, would sit very still for a very long time before writing anything in her report. The Dakin squadron at Kestrel Point consisted of 7 intercept-class vessels, experienced crew, a tactical commander named Battle Chief Vorak, who had 23 successful engagements on his record. They had approached the Riven Shore from 3 vectors simultaneously, the standard Dakin triangulation pattern that had worked reliably for 60 years. They expected resistance. They expected, possibly, some novel form of kinetic attempt that would confirm the humans were violating the Accords and give the Dakin the legal framework to escalate. What they did not expect was the *riven shore to simply hold position and do nothing visible for 14 seconds. The effect began before they could complete the triangulation. It began as a feeling, and the word feeling is important here, because it was not sound in any sense the Dakin crew could initially process as sound. It was a pressure in a register that their nervous systems were not equipped to dismiss. It was not pain. It was something worse than pain, because pain has a location. This had no location. It was everywhere inside the body simultaneously, a vibration that seemed to come from inside the skeleton, a frequency that the Dakin auditory processing centers could not categorize and therefore could not adapt to. Battle Chief Voruk would later describe it, in the official Dakin incident report, as the sound of certainty ending. He ordered retreat. He had never ordered retreat before in his life. The order came out of him not as a decision, but as a reflex, the same way a hand pulls back from heat before the brain consciously registers hot. 40 seconds after the *riven shore activated its system, all 7 Dakin vessels were accelerating away from Kestrel Point at maximum drive, and their crews were experiencing something that the Dakin had no cultural or psychological framework to process. The desire to go somewhere that felt safe, combined with the suspicion that nowhere ever would again. The riven shore had not fired a single projectile. Its hull showed no signs of having done anything. To any scanning system that was looking for kinetic weapons, it had simply sat in space and waited while the Dakin left. Which is why, when the Council's verification team reviewed the sensor logs of the engagement, their initial conclusion was that the riven shore had malfunctioned in some way, creating an unusual electromagnetic emission, and the Dakin had withdrawn for reasons they weren't disclosing publicly. That was the second misinterpretation. It lasted 9 days. Arbiter Tessavain. The voice on the secure channel belonged to a Dakin Council representative, which was unusual. The Dakin rarely communicated with Council enforcement directly, preferring to route everything through their diplomatic arm. We require a formal consultation regarding the human vessel at Kestrel Point. I've been expecting your call, Tessavain said. You understand what they did to our crew. It was not a question, she answered it anyway. I believe so. They have not violated any listed prohibition, the representative said. Tessavain had spoken with enough Dakin in her career to recognize the particular restraint in the voice, the way they compressed emotion into the spaces between words when they felt something they didn't want to feel. We have reviewed every article of the Meridian Accords. What the human vessel deployed is not categorized. No, Tessavain said, it isn't. Then you understand our position. Tell me anyway. A pause. When the Dakin representative spoke again, something in the register of the translation had changed, something the software wasn't quite capturing. We cannot fight something we cannot quantify, Arbiter. Our tactical doctrine requires quantification, threat assessment, force equivalence, damage projection. We need parameters. The pause again. Longer. The humans have created a weapon with no parameters. Tessavain thought about a note written in ink on actual paper. She thought about the phrase * they'll smell it before they see it. Make sure they do. That's the point. They didn't create it to have no parameters, she said slowly, working it out as she spoke. They created it to be just outside the parameters we were looking for. Another silence, and then, that is a distinction without a meaningful difference, Arbiter. I'm not sure it is, she said. I think the difference might be the most important thing about it. Here is what Tessavain understood, in the weeks following Kestrel Point, that the Council did not yet understand, and that she was struggling to explain in language that 14 different species could process without immediately reaching for institutional responses. The humans had not cheated. That was the thing. Cheating implied violating an agreement, and the humans had not violated any agreement. They had looked at the agreement, understood precisely what it was designed to prevent, and designed something that prevented none of those things while achieving every practical goal they had. They had read the rules with complete comprehension, and then operated in the gap between the rules and the intent of the rules with a precision that was, depending on how you looked at it, either brilliant or deeply unnerving. What it was, Tessavain had come to believe, was neither. It was adaptive. It was what happened when a species had spent its entire evolutionary history in an environment that routinely tried to kill it in new and creative ways, and had survived not by being stronger or faster, but by constantly, obsessively renegotiating the terms under which it was willing to be threatened. The Council's weapons assessors had a model for species that developed better weapons. They had a model for species that developed better defenses. They did not have a model for species that, when told they couldn't use one approach, experienced the prohibition not as a defeat but as a prompt. Prompt. As in, tell me I can't do it this way, and I will spend 11 months in a room with engineers and materials scientists and a specialist in non-Newtonian fluid dynamics, eating at my desk and sleeping in 4-hour intervals until I have found another way. And the other way will be worse. Not worse for me, worse for you. Priya Mock was in the Riven Shores engineering bay when Tessavain's secure channel request came through. She almost didn't accept it. She was elbow-deep in a calibration problem, and her hands were covered in a substance that smelled powerfully of ozone, and she had been awake for what she was choosing not to count as hours. But Alara had given her a look, the specific look that meant this matters even though I can't explain why right now, and so she'd wiped her hands and accepted. Engineer Mock, Tessavain said, I want to understand something. I'll try to help. Priya reached for her coffee. It was cold, she drank it anyway. When you designed the system, you understood the Council would update the Accords to cover it after the first use. Yes. And you built it anyway. Yes. Why? Tessavain's voice was careful, precise, the voice of someone genuinely trying to understand rather than prosecute. If you knew it would be prohibited after one use, why invest 11 months in it? Priya looked at her coffee cup for a moment. How long does it take your council to draft and ratify a new article of the Meridian Accords? A pause, typically 8 to 12 months. There's a formal consultation period. Right, Priya said. So we get 8 to 12 months of operational capability before the ban catches up to us. And while your council is drafting language to close the gap we found, we have 8 to 12 months to find the next gap. She set down the cup. We're not building weapons, Arbiter. We're building time. The silence on the channel lasted long enough that Priya began to wonder if the connection had dropped. Engineer Mock, Tessavain said finally, and something in her voice had shifted in a way that was hard to categorize. How many gaps are there? Priya smiled. It was the same smile Alara would have recognized, the one that was not particularly comfortable to receive. We've identified 37 areas of the Accords that have definitional gaps large enough to operate in. She paused. We've fully developed solutions for 9 of them. And the other 28. Partially developed, we have proof of concept for most. A few are still theoretical. She tilted her head. The theoretical ones are the interesting ones, honestly. The engineering is mostly straightforward once you identify the gap. It's finding the right question that's the hard part. You've been doing this since the Accords were signed, Tessavain said. It was not a question. Since before they were signed, Priya said. We started identifying gaps during the negotiation process. Another long silence. Then, you signed the Accords knowing you had already found ways around them. We signed the Accords, Priya said carefully, because we agreed with the intent. We don't want kinetic weapons proliferating any more than you do. We signed them honestly. She paused. We also made sure we wouldn't be helpless if we needed not to be. The silence this time was different, less stunned, more like something settling into place. That is the most honest thing I have heard in 40 years of diplomacy, Tessavain said finally, and the most terrifying. We find them to be compatible qualities, Priya said, and finished her cold coffee. The council convened an emergency session 14 days after Kestrel Point. Tessavain presented her findings in formal session, with all 14 species represented. She used precise language and cited specific documentation. She did not editorialize. She had learned over 40 years that editorializing in formal sessions gave the audience somewhere to focus their discomfort that wasn't on the information itself, and she needed them focused on the information. She presented the shipping manifests, the design sessions log, the Dakin incident report, the conversation with Priya Mach, which she had recorded with Mach's knowledge and consent, and which Mach had reviewed for factual accuracy before Tessavain submitted it. The council's response was both predictable and inadequate. "The accords must be expanded," said the Voth representative. "Immediately. Sound-based weaponry must be classified and prohibited under the same framework as kinetic." "They have 37 gaps identified," Tessavain said. "Fully developed solutions for 9, partially developed for most of the rest." The room went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when everyone in them is recalibrating. "Then we expand the accords to cover all of them," the Ceralian representative said. "They identified those gaps during the negotiation of the current accords," Tessavain said. "What is your expectation for the next negotiation?" Another silence, longer. "Arbiter," the Muranth representative said, and the translation gave his words a careful quality. "What are you recommending?" Tessavain looked at the table. At 14 species, representing the longest continuous interstellar government in known history, a body that had governed conflict and negotiated peace, and ratified 400 years of mutual existence. A body that had looked at humanity and seen a young civilization that needed management, regulation, a framework within which it could be shaped into something orderly. "I am recommending," she said, "that we stop trying to contain what humans can do and start trying to understand why they do it, because we keep banning the last thing they built, and they keep building the next thing during the ban, and the next thing is always worse." She paused. "Not worse in the sense of more dangerous, worse in the sense of harder to anticipate, harder to categorize, harder to write an accord around." "Then what do we do?" the Dakin representative said. Tessavain had thought about this for 14 days. She had thought about an engineer eating at her desk for 11 months, about a handwritten note on paper about smell, about a species that had looked at prohibition and experienced it as a prompt. "We ask them what they're building next," she said, "before they have to use it." What the council learned in the following months, through a process that bore no resemblance to any diplomatic engagement in the historical record, because it required council representatives to sit in rooms with engineers and material scientists, and listen to people explain problems they were solving for hypothetical futures that hadn't happened yet, was that Priya Mach had understated the number of gaps. Not intentionally. The new gaps kept emerging as they talked, because the process of explaining the existing gaps to people who hadn't seen them revealed new gaps in the explanations themselves, which revealed structural assumptions in the accords that no one had examined because they seemed self-evident, and nothing that seems self-evident ever is. Ilara Vasquez sat in on most of these sessions. She did not speak often. When she did, it was usually to ask the question that made the room go quiet, not a hostile question, not an aggressive one, just the specific kind of question that a person asks when they have been responsible for other people in dangerous situations long enough to develop an instinct for where the assumptions are hiding. During one session, the Voth representative, a different one from Surveyor 3rd Commies, a senior policy architect named Consensus Builder Ithran, asked her directly, "Commander Vasquez, When your team was identifying these gaps, what were you afraid of? The room went quiet. It was not the question anyone else had thought to ask. Alara was quiet for a moment. Outside the station's viewport, the meridian belt drifted slowly in its ancient orbit. Billions of tons of rock and ice, arranged by physics into patient, mindless beauty. That we'd need to use them, she said. We were afraid we'd need to use them. But you used the acoustic system at Kestrel Point. Yes. Because you needed to. Because the alternative was worse. She looked at Ithran steadily. We don't build these things because we want to use them. We build them because we don't want to be in a position where the only option we have is the one you've prohibited. She paused. Every gap we identified was a situation where we might need a choice, and the Accords were going to take that choice away. Ithran was quiet for a long moment. You fear helplessness, he said, more than conflict. We fear having no options, Alara said. It's not the same thing. Options mean we can choose de-escalation. Options mean we can choose the least harmful path. When you take away our options in the name of safety, you don't make us safer. You make us more dangerous because the only thing we have left is the thing you didn't think to ban yet. The silence in the room was the kind that happens when something true has been said in a way that cannot be unsaid. Tessavain, sitting at the back of the room, was already revising her report. The second session with Priya Mach happened late in the process, when most of the policy architects had left for the day, and the station's lighting had shifted to its dimmer evening cycle, and Priya was still there because she was always still there. Tessavain found her reviewing schematics on a handheld that looked like it had survived several serious impacts. You have the 28, Tessavain said, not a question. Priya didn't look up, mostly. I want to see the theoretical ones. Priya looked up then, studied the arbiter for a moment with the particular expression of someone deciding how much to trust a thing that seems trustworthy. Then she turned the handheld around. Tessavain looked at the schematics for a long time. She understood perhaps a third of what she was seeing. What she understood was enough. This one, she said, pointing, this isn't a weapon. No, Priya agreed. It's a communication system. It's both, Priya said, depending on how you tune it. Tessavain straightened. You developed a weapon and a peacekeeping communication tool from the same underlying technology. The same underlying physics, Priya corrected gently. We didn't develop anything, we found it, it was always there. She took the handheld back. That's the thing about gaps, Arbiter. They're not gaps we create. They're gaps that exist in any framework built by minds that can't see everything. We just look for them. Because you were afraid. Because we were afraid, Priya agreed. And because being afraid and doing it anyway is the only thing we know how to do consistently. The station hummed around them with the sound of controlled systems, of life support and navigation, and all the quiet mechanical effort of keeping something alive in the void between stars. The 28th gap, Tessavain said, the last theoretical one. Priya was quiet. Have you solved it? A long silence. Priya looked at the schematics on her handheld, then she looked at Tessavain. We're close, she said. 8 months, maybe. What does it do? Priya smiled. The uncomfortable smile, the one that was not particularly comforting to receive from someone who had already demonstrated what 11 months of focused human problem-solving produced when given a prohibition as its prompt. It makes the question of whether you can ban it irrelevant, she said. Because by the time you see it, you'll have already decided you don't want to. Tessavain returned to her office. She filed her revised report. It contained a recommendation unlike anything in the Council's 400-year history. Not a new prohibition, not an expanded accord, not a framework for containment or management or shaping of human behavior into something orderly. It recommended a partnership. Full technical disclosure, both directions. Human engineers embedded in accord drafting sessions, specifically to identify the gaps, because if the gaps were going to be found anyway, finding them in the light was better than finding them in the dark. It was, she noted in the final paragraph, not the recommendation of a confident institution. It was the recommendation of an institution that had finally understood something it had spent 40 years misunderstanding, that humanity's advantage was not any specific technology, not the sound system, or the pending 28th solution, or the 37 gaps, or the 9 fully developed alternatives to prohibited approaches. Their advantage was the asterisk process itself. The 11 months in a room, the cold coffee, the handwritten notes on paper that no one expected to see, the refusal to experience a closed door as anything other than an invitation to find the window. You could not ban that. You could not regulate it, contain it, or write an accord around it. You could only decide whether you wanted it working with you or around you. The council voted on the recommendation 3 weeks later. The vote was not unanimous. The Dakin abstained, which was as close as they came to endorsement from a position of discomfort. The Ceralian hegemony required 7 additional sessions, and the specific assurance that human engineers would not have access to the hegemony's own internal compliance documents, an assurance that was given and noted, and that Tessavain privately suspected the humans found faintly amusing. The Voth representative, consensus builder Ithran, voted in favor without conditions. When asked by his delegation why, he said only that Commander Vasquez had asked him a question he didn't know the answer to, and that he preferred to learn the answer in a structured environment. The question she had asked was, "What would you build if you were us?" He had not known. He still didn't know. But he had begun, for the first time in his 40-year career, to think about it, and that seemed, on balance, more valuable than another accord. Alara Vasquez flew the asterisk-riven shore back to human space 6 months later, with the first cohort of council observers formally embedded in her crew. A Voth systems analyst, a young Muranth engineer who had specifically requested the posting, and who spent the first 3 weeks asking questions, and the next 3 weeks asking better questions, and a Dakin tactical observer named Secondrank Soval, who did not speak to anyone for the first month, and then, one evening in the ship's common area, sat down next to Priya Mach and watched her work in silence for an hour before saying, "Show me what you're building." Priya looked at him. She had been eating, she was always eating, and she set down her food and turned her handheld around, and showed him the 28th theoretical solution, the one that was 8 months from realization, the one that made the question of prohibition irrelevant. Soval studied it for a long time. His expression shifted in ways that the human crew, watching from the periphery, couldn't fully read. Something moved through the Dakin's face that might have been the beginning of understanding, or the beginning of awe, or the first moment of genuine fear of something you can't quantify and therefore cannot dismiss. "This isn't a weapon," he said finally. "No," Priya agreed. "It's leverage," he looked at her, "over the entire framework, the whole structure of how we regulate each other." "We prefer to think of it as a conversation," Priya said. "A conversation you control. A conversation we can participate in," she corrected, "from a position where the other party doesn't benefit from ignoring us." Soval was quiet for a long time. Outside the viewports, stars moved in their slow, incomprehensible drift, ancient light arriving from sources that had burned for billions of years before any of them existed, and would burn for billions more after all of them were gone. "Your people have been afraid," he said, "not as accusation, as recognition." "Yes," Priya said simply. "For how long?" She thought about it. Seriously, genuinely considered the question in the way that the humans on the asterisk-riven shore considered questions, as if the question itself deserved the full weight of attention before an answer was offered. "Always," she said, "we have always been afraid. We built the first tools out of fear, the first walls, The first compacts and agreements and systems of law, everything we have ever made, we made because we were afraid and making something was better than doing nothing. She looked at the handheld. The difference between us and every other species the Council has managed is not that we're brave. We're not particularly brave. It's that we never figured out how to let the fear stop us. Sovol looked at the 28th solution for another long moment. Then he said, "Teach me." And that was the thing, the real thing, the thing that Tessavane's report had tried to capture and never quite succeeded at. The thing that the Council would spend decades trying to properly understand and never fully categorize. That when a species that runs on fear and refuses to stop sits across from any other species and offers to share what it has built in the dark, the correct answer is never to say no. The correct answer is to sit down. The correct answer is to ask to be taught. Because the alternative, the long alternative, the one that stretches out across 8 to 12-month accord ratification cycles, while 11 months of focused human problem-solving runs quietly in the background, eating at its desk, drinking cold coffee, writing notes in ink on actual paper. The alternative is to sit across from something that has always been afraid and has never once let that stop it, and try to build rules around it, and realize, too late, that you've been building a floor while they've been building a window. The Council was not the strongest government in the galaxy. It was not even the most determined. It was simply the oldest, and old things, given the right kind of fear, learn to be very, very good at adaptation. It just took them 40 years and one very small ship in the Meridian Belt, and an engineer who would not stop eating long enough to sleep, and a commander who asked the question no one else had thought to ask to remember that. The Riven Shore crossed back into human space at 3:42 station time. The ship's log recorded it as routine transit. No flags, no anomalies, no sensor signatures above any regulated threshold. In the common area, a Dakin tactical observer who had not spoken to anyone for a month was bent over a set of schematics, asking questions, getting answers, writing notes.